Okay. Hi, everybody. We have some attendees here. Thanks for joining us. For some of you, very, very early in the morning, um, and for others of you, late in the evening. So today, I'm just going to quick do an intro, and then I just wanted to walk through how things will go quickly. And this slot was supposed to be our keynote presenter who was unfortunately not able to come. So I'm going to do an intro and then a little bit of my talk, but it will be kind of a shortened version because I want to get intro and some content in. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. If everyone who isn't the interpreter and isn't presenting could turn off your videos right now, that would be great. And for those of you who are attending, so attendees, your video and audio are off. And you can ask questions in the chat or Q&A, and then you can also raise your hand. And we'll have this time Alex or Natalia will be moderating that during the question period. And then panelists, you do have the option to share your video and audio, but I ask that we don't do that while the presenters are presenting. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. All right, can we see my screen? And so today, welcome everybody to our workshop, New Perspectives on Word Order Flexibility. And so I'm Savi, and Natalia Levshina and Alex Kramer are my two co-organizers of the workshop, and you'll hear from both of them about their own individual research tomorrow, but you'll see them chairing and moderating and stuff later on today. So this is us. I'm not the snowman, and Natalia and Alex. And so I wanted to start out a little bit giving an intro to this workshop, some questions that guide the research that you'll see today. This is not obviously exhaustive, but just things that all of us are thinking about. Sorry, I just see something in the chat, so I want to make sure. Okay, gotcha. Are thinking about, and then actually, there we go. So one question is, how should we categorize languages, like individual languages, when it comes to word or constituent order? What other factors contribute to or correlate with flexibility? So one question that I have that's related to that is flexibility epiphenomenal in word and constituent order? How can we best measure flexibility or variation in order? You'll see a lot of talks about that. What do different measures tell us? I'll talk a little bit about that. And how does flexibility influence language dynamics? So contact, change, and learning and exposure and use across the lifespan. And so I'm going to start and talk a little bit about this one just because it represents, I think, a view that a lot of us are taking in this workshop. So this is sort of a traditional way of thinking about how to categorize languages when it comes to flexibility and constituent order. So we can think of language as being either morphological or positional, configurational or non-configurational, pragmatic or syntactic, free or fixed, flexible or rigid. So right under this type of view, we have two groups, like languages are divided into two groups. But what we know, and all of us here know, is that, right, in languages that are morphological, we know that orders are not like all the same, or they're not like the same in terms of frequency or discourse function or anything like that. And in languages that are, there's often languages that are misidentified as being strongly rigid or positional because non-canonical orders are under-described. And this is definitely true of the language that I work on, Malayalam, that you'll hear a little bit about today. And so this is like, what I'm saying, gradient approach to flexible constituent order, but Natalia's written about this in this great paper in linguistic typology as well. And Futrell et al. Have a paper that is also taking this approach, right? So what a lot of us are arguing for is, instead of categorizing languages as either morphological, positional, or whatever your favorite term is, we're thinking about them as more or less flexible. All languages, we're assuming that all languages exist on a single cline. And we can measure that in different ways. So higher entropy, lower entropy. And I'm going to talk about a smaller difference in acceptability between orders versus a bigger difference in acceptability between orders. And so here, just like showing you some of the methods, you'll see there's a lot of awesome corpus studies coming up, which I'm really excited about, collected lots of different ways. So via documentation, written text, spoken text, subtitles, different types of measures. So that's going to be really exciting as well. We'll see a lot of different ways of operationalizing this within corpora. We'll see production, acceptability, eye tracking, phylogenetic clusters, looking at aerial versus, oh my God, I can't think of the word, inherited traits. And some of the language that you'll see, this is going to be a bunch of languages that I'm throwing up. I just took languages that were mentioned in your abstracts, participants. So these are some of the languages that you'll see. And one thing I did want to mention is we don't have any sign languages yet, but hopefully people who are working on sign languages will be inspired by some of the work you see in this workshop and decide to take this approach. And so, yeah, we have a lot of different languages, a lot of different varieties of languages, contact varieties. So that's going to be really exciting to see coming up. And here's our presenters in chronological order, sort of going like this. And I've color coded us based on where we are geographically. So this is some of explaining why not everyone is here right now and why some people are drinking coffee and other people are eating dinner. And so we have folks from all over, which I'm really excited about. And then make sure to come back tomorrow. There's a separate link to register tomorrow if you haven't already for the final talks and the discussion. All right, so you wanted to split it up so that it wouldn't be too hard on people for whom the time zones are especially difficult. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna very quickly, let's see how much time I have left. Really quickly, I'm gonna talk about a little bit of my work. My full slides and the abstract are up on OSF. Like, my goal wasn't to really give my full talk. I really wanted to make sure that, you know, we situated the workshop. So this will be high level. All right, so I'm gonna present to you and show you a series of acceptability judgment experiments. So these are experiments where participants hear sentences and you'll hear, and in these different experiments, we've done it in, you'll see 5 different languages where participants hear sentences and in isolation, and they're asked to rate each sentence from 1 to 7 based on how good those sentences sound. And so one thing that we know, so I do this, one thing that we know is that non-canonical versus canonical orders. So I'm, you know, using canonical that's determined based on discourse and other literature. So it's not really necessarily determined based on the experiment itself. So having a notion of non-canonical. When we have non-canonical orders, we know that they result in increased processing difficulty and lowered acceptability as compared to canonical orders. And so what we've done is ask participants to rate all 6 logical orders of animate subjects, inanimate objects, and transitive verbs. So here I'm talking just about major constituent order. And this is also amongst many filler sentences of differing acceptability. So that's really important because participants don't know what the experiment is about, but we do get a rating for, you know, several ratings for each of the orders within participant. And the way that I'm operationalizing flexibility here is that a relative preference for a canonical order is decreased flexibility. So the greater difference between orders is less flexibility, and the more that the orders are rated similarly to each other without a discourse context is increased flexibility. Okay, and so I want to use this to compare languages. So we're going to see comparing across languages. And comparing within languages, so Korean speakers in Korea, we might not get to this, Korean speakers in the US who speak Korean, and Korean speakers in the US who just understand but don't speak Korean. And then also Malayalam speakers of different ages, and we're going to treat age as a continuous variable. Okay, so I'm going to show you some data comparing across languages, and what you'll see is what we've taken for each language, the canonical order, and then that's like the baseline, and subtracted the non-canonical orders. And again, this is the canonical order I said, like in the literature for languages for which we have that. And so you'll see that we'll have done that by participant. And then what I'm assuming or proposing is that larger differences equals more flexible. All right, and so you'll see a graph like this. So each dot will represent a single participant, and you'll see the means and 2 standard deviations plotted. And the languages are going to be ordered from most to least flexible based on this. Okay, so first I'll show you the ordering of languages, because maybe that's not like intuitive. And then this is what it looks like, okay? And so you'll see there's different numbers of dots for each of the experiments, right? So there's a lot of details here that I'm glossing over. But that 0 line is meaningful here. And so dots that are below the 0 line, that means that it's not the case that non-canonical orders are consistently rated lower than canonical orders. So here we might want to rethink like, oh, is that really the canonical order of the language? What does that mean, right? And we know from other literature that what the canonical order is can often be based on different types of context or genre or things like that, register. But we see sort of this like pattern, and there's not, there's only 5 languages here. I have some additional varieties plotted separately. So there's not like a ton more I can say right now without getting more types of languages, but I wanted to show you, this is the direction that this research is going. So what we're going to be doing is looking at more languages, and languages that vary systematically in terms of language family, in terms of other linguistic features and other features of the ecology of the language as well. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that. And now I'm going to quick show you comparison within languages. So we'll see Korean speakers first. And so here what I'm going to show you is a graph. So this is going to be the mean difference between SOV, which is the canonical order in Korean, and the other orders. And these are going to be bar graphs. And we have 3 groups of speakers, right? So we have Korean speakers who grew up in Korea. We have Korean speakers who grew up in the US and speak Korean fluently, but and speak Korean fluently. And we have Korean speakers who grew up in the US and speak Korean don't speak Korean fluently, but understand it very well. All right, so like receptive bilinguals is what I would say. So we have this, what we see, and I'll show you this a little bit later, there's the same qualitative pattern across these groups. But we see a difference, which is this. So if we plot the mean difference between the canonical and non-canonical orders, we see this gradual increase in that difference, which I'm operationalizing as a decrease in flexibility. So increased dominance in English is corresponding to increased reliance on SOV. Okay. And for people who are curious, SVO, which is the canonical order in English, was not different across groups. And there's, I have a CLS paper on this as well. So if you're interested, there's more details. All right, now I'm going to show you some data for Malayalam. So here we're treating age. So before we had these 3 groups, and there was a reason to put them into 3 distinct groups because there were very different patterns of use across those groups. Here, I'm going to show you the result of some fieldwork experiments that I did a few years ago, where participants were all living in the same types of communities. And we have age plotted on the x-axis, and the difference between SOV, which is the canonical order in Malayalam, and OSV on the y-axis. And so we picked that, I picked that because other statistical tests showed me that that was the only difference between those, participants. And so this is a way of zeroing in on how these participants differ. So each dot is going to represent a single participant's that difference for them. And the older and younger speakers only differed in that way. So this is why I'm plotting it in this way. So what we see is it's like a weak correlation, but it is significant, which is that there's a negative correlation. So age is negatively correlated with flexibility. So for younger people, there's a bigger difference between canonical and non-canonical orders than there is for the older speakers. And in fact, for the older speakers, if you bin them together, there is not a difference. So for Korean, increased dominance in English corresponds to increased preference for canonical order, which I'm calling, again, decreased flexibility. And for Malayalam, age is negatively correlated with preference for canonical order. So again, decreased flexibility. You might be thinking, why? And like I said, I don't have a ton of time to talk about this. I'm happy to discuss a lot about this later, and I'm writing about this and things like that. But I'm thinking about this from a usage-based approach. So we expect differences based on different contexts of exposure and use. And so for the English dominant Korean speakers and the younger Malayalam speakers, there's actually a lot of similarities in their linguistic ecologies, especially when it comes to decreased experience with Korean and Malayalam respectively, and increased experience with English. And so we see the same type of pattern in these two contexts that are different in some ways, but also similar when it comes to context of use. And so this is something that I'm exploring more. And we're looking at this in other languages as well. Okay. So I just want to sum up here. We can compare across languages using this method. And in order to say something stronger about what things correlate with this flexibility measure, I need more data, and we're working on that, but it does seem promising. For the languages that we have checked, so for Korean and Malayalam and English, the results do align with corpora databases. So we're not getting qualitatively different results with this measure. But for me, it was very important because, so for Malayalam, there isn't an appropriate corpus to look at this thing. So not yet anyway. So Natalia and I have talked about looking at some subtitles, and that might be a little bit better than the written language corpora. But in languages where there isn't a written form or there aren't corpora at all, which are most languages, it seems like this is a way to go. And the process of doing these experiments, if you're working with speakers, which I have, so I should have said at the beginning, and I'll say it again at the end, this is all collaborative work with people who are speakers of these languages, with linguists who are speakers of these languages. We do, so that part is, that part is necessary. But if that is the situation that you're in, if you're working with speakers, it isn't very hard to get this going and to analyze the data. And in fact, if you're interested in doing this yourself, I have R scripts and things set up that's very sort of a build your own experiment already set up. So let me know if that's something you're interested in. And we can, so this type of measure allows for gradient patterns across and within languages. So it could be that languages do cluster categorically, although Natalia's work, I think, has shown that it probably isn't the case. But the important thing is that we're using a measure that allows for gradients. So we're not assuming categoricity from the very beginning. And we have, then we'll, if we assume categoricity from the beginning, and if our measures are categorical, then that's what our outcome is going to be, right? And so that's sort of the idea here. So acceptable judgments are just one measure, right? They can, give us something. And like I said earlier, they can give us information about languages and varieties without corpora. They can give us information about the individual. So all these experiments were accompanied with either sociolinguistic interviews or extensive language background surveys. So I'm really interested in contact and change in constituent order. And so that's something that we have a lot of info on. And so we can look at how individual and groups' language experience influence flexibility. But the other thing that it can give us is information about non-canonical orders in a way that, that traditional methods don't. So I think you can do some of this in corpus-based methods, but we see some kind of interesting patterns. And I want to show you some stuff just because I'm trying to figure it out and I'm not exactly sure where to go with it. I'm curious if people have ideas. So right earlier I said that the Korean speakers, the three groups have the same qualitative pattern. Well, how do we know? It's because we were able to plot, right, their relative ratings or their ratings for each of the different orders. So I'm going to show you a graph. On the bottom are the orders, so SOV, OSV, the verb medial orders, and the verb final orders. And on this y-axis is the z-score corrected ratings. So this is Korean speakers in Korea, and you're going to see violin plots. All right, so the distribution of ratings, and then the means and 2 standard deviations. And so this is what that looks like. So I'm calling this a constituent order profile. All right. And I've highlighted the canonical order SOV here. And so I'm going to draw some boxes, and this is what the stats tell us about how the orders group together, right? So we see 4 groups here. We see the canonical order is rated highest, followed by OSV, and then the verb medial and verb final orders are rated the same, like similarly to each other. Okay. And so this is what we found, and actually for all 3 groups of Korean speakers, we found this same exact qualitative pattern, just the differences were bigger, right? And that's what that other graph showed us. But the more languages we looked at, we found something kind of interesting. And so I'm going to show you now. So here, oh, everyone came up. So we have Avar, Malayalam, Spanish, Korean, and English, and we have just the like lower contact varieties of each of these. And so again, these are violin plots, and the dots are means. And so what I'm going to show you is how the languages group. And so this is something that we found, and I'm not sure how to think about this. For non-canonical verb positions, even in Spanish, which is like, you know, it's a flexible language, but it's, you know, head initial language. The other languages are head final. I'm graying out English because it's not relevant here because all the orders aren't grammatical. So in all these languages, all the orders are grammatical. And what we see is for the non-canonical verb positions, there isn't any difference between argument orders. And we see that consistently across languages. So I'm not really sure what to do with that. There's a lot of remaining questions here, right? So, you know, we have, we want to triangulate with other measures. We have an AMLAP poster coming up next week, looking at this with pupilometry in Spanish. Alex is gonna look at structural priming, right? So we're interested in comparing to entropy measures. Like I said, more languages is necessary, and moving beyond transitive verbs with animate agents and inanimate patients, right? That's very limited. It's necessary to start somewhere to compare across languages. But as we'll see in talks coming up, that's not gonna tell us the full picture of what's going on. We have some other languages in the pipeline. And then I wanna thank participants and collaborators, especially who made these experiments possible. And let me know if you're interested in doing this in your own language. Like I said, I sort of have things set up in a way that makes it relatively easy. And I think it's kind of a cool opportunity, and it's pretty quick to do. Okay, so where am I at? Okay, just a few minutes over. So you can enter questions in the chat or do the raise hand function. So if you do the raise hand function, we can unmute you. If you do questions in the chat, Natalia will moderate that. And we'll have about, for everyone, 5 to 7 minutes for questions, and then 3 to 5 minutes for transition across speakers. So I just wanted to give that info. And then I am done. All right, any questions? All right.
I guess everyone is thinking.
It's early, and it's also okay if you don't. I gave you so many like high level things, but a lot of detail, so it's fine.
There are some questions, hands raised in the...
Oh, there are hands raised, okay. So Natalia, if you want, you can unmute those people and then they can answer the question or ask the question.
Ah, okay, now I see. Okay, perfect. Then, sorry. I'm very sorry, I can't do it right now.
It's okay. Maybe I can do it.
I think I see it.
Okay. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, so let's see, release, mute. Is it working? I think you should be live, Shiri.
Okay. Okay, so hi, and first of all, thank you for the talk. It was super interesting and also really surprising because I feel that what you said, for example, about the negative correlation with bilingualism, even though usually we tend to think about bilinguals as being more flexible rather than and more accepting of different variants, and you showing that actually less accepting. And I was wondering about your explanation that it's about, from a usage-based perspective, that it's about not having enough exposure to all the different pragmatic contexts. And that seems really interesting and likely. And I was wondering whether in your different sentences, you can kind of differentiate sentences, I don't know, out of context or with non-special pragmatic context versus those that have the pragmatic context that allows this different order, and see whether indeed, basically if what you're saying is true, then you should find differences between the young and the old, or the proficient and non-proficient, in the sentences that have additional pragmatic context that affords these changes, but not in the standard ones. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So one thing is, right, all of the, in the languages that we, in Korean and in Malayalam, the non-canonical orders do each, like all of them do by definition almost have their own types of pragmatic context that like license them or make them better. And so the reason, one of the reasons why I didn't like include discourse context in at least my Malayalam data, and there is I have another experiment that looks into that a little bit more, is because we don't know a ton about what those contexts are exactly and how those things align directly. So that's like one thing I wanted to say, because often people ask me that. So kind of this data answers that question a little bit, which is that all the non-canonical orders are by definition going to require some type of special context. However, something that I really want to do is, and this again, thinking more from a usage-based perspective, is look at the different items specifically within the orders, right? So there might be some particular verbs or contexts that are more context specific or weirder, you know, in certain cases, or less frequent in those non-canonical orders or in those non-canonical contexts than others. And that's something that I have not done yet, but that is like where this research is going. So I do want to take a look at that, because I would suspect that that's the case. And in fact, so work by like Ad Bacchus and their group looking at Turkish and Dutch bilinguals and, you know, constitutional order change, they've found that you get like, so SVO orders in Turkish based on, you know, subject verb pairings that are like highly frequent and then sort of become chunked. And I have some anecdotal experience, you know, idea anyway, that probably is going on in Malayalam at least. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question. That's definitely, you know, in some cases we have the answer to that, but I would predict, as you said, that sort of the stranger cases would be rated lower. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We've got a question from Paulo. Alex, could you please unmute, because I'm not a co-host?
Yes, so there.
Oh, that's why. I'm sorry.
Yes, sorry. Thank you for your paper. It was very interesting. I'm an Italian speaker, mother tongue speaker, and I research in Hungarian. So I know two very different languages, and I was, but I don't know very well how to read your numbers. But I've noticed about Spanish in particular, the different results. And I was wondering what kind of corpora are you using? So my question is if there is a proportion between the number of sentences you are considering when numbering, when deciding the different percentage of one or the other word order. And of course, it remains the problems of acceptability, because in Italian, it is very different if you are speaking or if you are writing. In speaking, the non-canonical orders can be accepted much easier than in writing. And while in Hungarian, I don't think you have any canonical order. You must know exactly what are you saying, because pragmatics is deciding the word order. And a mother tongue speaker in context perfectly knows whether you are making an error or not. I hope I understood myself. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that question as we transition. So I'm going to stop my share and have, I think Gabi is going to share her screen next. So I just wanted to say that so that we stay kind of on schedule. So let me just, do that. But yeah, good question. So I'll just quickly answer part of it, which is that we know and we expect that, you know, based on written versus spoken language, there's likely going to be differences and differential differences across languages. And so actually Alex is going to talk about this later. I think someone else will, and that's why I have spoken language stimuli. So it's, you know, the proper prosody is available for everybody when they're reading the sentences. But one thing that is really important to know is that in these different languages, it's going to be different. So in some languages, the written language might be more flexible than the spoken language. In other languages, you might see really big differences if there's discourse context and versus not. And so that is something that we need to just make sure that we're comparing similarly across languages. And that's sort of a limitation of this, is that we need to have similar contexts, you know, in order to make sure that we're comparing the same thing. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there and let's have, and I'm gonna hide my video and everything and let Natalia introduce the next talk.